Hello and welcome to Dr. Owen's Muscle Medicine. In today's video, we're exploring the scientific evidence surrounding the claims that creatine supplementation can cause hair loss. To do this, we're going to look at this research paper that, when it was published back in 2009, caused the creatine causes baldness speculation hype train to leave the station. Then we'll talk about what the findings mean, how they sit within the wider context of research on creatine, and how concerned we should be about the findings. Now, the first noteworthy points here are: this study was only 3 weeks in duration, and it didn't measure hair loss directly. Instead, it measured blood levels of testosterone and dihydrotestosterone in the 20 university-aged rugby players included in the study. The findings, which we'll get into, suggest a plausible mechanism for indirect acceleration of hair loss through the following process. We know that individuals that are genetically predisposed to male pattern baldness have hair follicles on their heads, mostly over the scalp and crown regions, that contain DHT receptors, and they progressively shrink in response to long-term exposure to DHT binding to these receptors. So, if creatine supplementation causes long-term sustained rises in DHT levels in the bloodstream, and these hormones flow to the scalp in sufficiently high concentrations, then creatine supplementation has a plausible mechanism by which it could accelerate the process of male pattern baldness in those of us with the genetic susceptibility of having these hair follicles that shrink in response to the binding of DHT, or dihydrotestosterone. Anyways, without further ado, let's get into the paper. So, this is what we've got. A double-blind placebo-controlled trial of 20 college or university-age rugby players, 10 of which are going to be loaded onto 25 grams of creatine for a week, then 5 grams for the further 2 weeks, and a placebo group taking sugar pills. And it's noteworthy that there was a 6-week washout period before the study began. So let's look at the methodology. So in the methodology, we have our 20 18 to 19-year-old white males who have taken no supplements for 6 weeks before the start of the study, and were randomized based on a random alternating pattern based on their arrival to where the trial was being conducted. And we see the dosing protocols, so you're getting 25 grams, a heavy loading dose of creatine with 25 grams of glucose for a week, followed by 5 grams and 25 of sugar, or you're having the same weight but pure glucose in the placebo arm. So we had these 20 rugby players undertaking standardized training, albeit for different player positions. This is worth a short digression because it's interesting that rugby used to be considered a game for all body shapes and sizes, and you only have to look at a prop and a fullback to understand that they must have very different training programs and diets. And we also know that cardiovascular training and weight training cause transient increases in male sex hormones. However, average body mass, body fat, and fat-free mass are broadly the same across both groups, suggesting one has not been inadvertently loaded with scrawny whippets, as seen here. And on to the crux of the issue. This table shows us testosterone and dihydrotestosterone levels at day 0, 7, and 21. As we can see, a little surprisingly, the creatine group has relatively low levels of both testosterone and dihydrotestosterone compared to the placebo group at day 0. Although these differences failed to achieve statistical significance, it is nonetheless odd, and there is reason for concern that either the randomization process is flawed, or that the study size is sufficiently small that an outlier or two can affect the data produced in the study. And again, it's the only study on this that we have. Anyways, as we scan across, we find that the creatine group's testosterone levels increased to pretty much match the level of the placebo group, though again, without achieving a statistically significant amount of difference. Or in other words, we cannot boldly claim that these small changes mean anything and are the product of anything other than random chance. Then, when it comes to dihydrotestosterone, we watch the placebo group experience a small, statistically insignificant dip, which is a bit of a head scratcher, and the creatine group's DHT levels initially soar at day 7 before dropping back a bit, but remaining above the placebo group at day 21. Now, if we go down to the discussion, the authors acknowledge that this is the first study to measure DHT levels directly in creatine supplementation, and unfortunately, as of 2025 and the recording of this video, they remain the only people to have done so and publish their work in a peer-reviewed journal. So there we have it. 3 weeks of creatine supplementation with vigorous exercise caused a group of 10 rugby players with a surprising pre-study relative lack of DHT to overtake their placebo-taking peers at 1 week and remain ahead, but slightly less so at 3 weeks. That is literally all in terms of published peer-reviewed scientific data on the matter. Let's get into what that means. Firstly, we'll critique the paper and then address the dearth of supporting or refuting evidence that has failed to materialize in the subsequent 16 years. This paper took a really small sample size and studied them over a short duration. This is problematic as male pattern baldness is a slow and chronic process occurring over months and years. The paper also failed to declare the creatine product used and whether or not it had been batch tested for impurities and contaminants. This is important because many such products contain traces of androgenic steroids such as testosterone and nandrolone, and perhaps even DHT itself. There's a link in the video description to an old 2002 study that found around 15% of legitimate sports supplements tested at an IOC-verified lab in Germany contain traces of these androgenic steroids. And in terms of increasing scientific rigor, given the peaks and troughs of male sex hormones seen around training, it would have been good to have a standard protocol of blood draw timings in relation to exercise to mitigate this potential confounding factor. And lastly, the results seem to suggest a dose-dependent relationship between creatine and DHT, with DHT being higher at the end of the loading phase than at the end of the maintenance phase. Next, on to all the other data. Well, there isn't any. I couldn't find a single other study on PubMed, Google Scholar, or anywhere else directly measuring blood DHT levels or hair loss in response to creatine supplementation, and that is despite creatine being an otherwise well-researched supplement that's been widely available and broadly used for over 30 years. This is unsatisfactory, but it is a lot easier to call for bigger, longer, and more rigorous studies than it is to fund and do them. I hope it happens, but it seems rather unlikely at this moment in time. So that's something, a study that's suggestive that creatine may accelerate the male pattern baldness process in those who are susceptible. On the other hand, we do have a study linked in the video notes below looking into the potential cardiovascular benefits of creatine monohydrate, the most popular form of this supplement, that found creatine supplementation increases microvascular blood flow. The relevance of this is that minoxidil foam and red light laser therapy, both validated and FDA-approved treatments for male pattern baldness, do their business through increasing local blood flow to the scalp. So it doesn't seem unreasonable to me. Somebody might have come across this study and tentatively speculated exactly the opposite hypothesis, that creatine might be a viable treatment option for treating male pattern baldness hair loss, along a similarly long chain of inferences and extrapolation from very limited data. In summary, the question as to whether or not creatine supplementation will cause hair loss remains somewhat vexed by the lack of high quality, reproduced data in any particular direction. So, if you're thinking of taking creatine, the best thing to do is a risk-reward assessment, including evaluating your own propensity or risk for male pattern baldness, and if you are susceptible, asking yourself how important it is to your self-image and self-esteem that your hairline remains where it is for as long as possible, and weighing this up against the potential gains you hope to make from taking the supplement. Set against this is another important point. If you're taking creatine to add reps in the gym or on the track, then you're likely also doing all the right stuff for keeping your testosterone levels high by training without overtraining, maintaining sufficient dietary intake of appropriate fats, and maintaining sufficiently low body fat levels to avoid excessive conversion of testosterone to estrogen. If these things all ring true, and your hair follicles are susceptible to DHT-induced shrinkage, the bad news is that DHT is made of testosterone, which we want to keep high for obvious performance reasons. So, sooner or later, creatine or no creatine, you are going to have to either consider direct management and treatment of male pattern baldness, or attempt to become emotionally equanimous to your hairline's inevitable marching retreat, which, from personal experience, is much easier to say than do. In fact, one of the reasons I keep so much hair on the top of my head is so that it covers these shiny bits of extra forehead I didn't used to have. On that note, that's all for today's video. I hope that given the constraints of the data desert we find ourselves standing in, you've found it interesting and informative. If you have, please consider liking the video and hitting subscribe. Bye for now.